Hello, my name is Emily Bagwell. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the resource manager for Reconciling Ministries Network. And one of the joys that I have in this position is working with our extension ministries. And Parents Reconciling Network is one of those. It's a group that's been around for a long time doing a variety of different work in the movement, working for full inclusion and justice for LGBTQ children, friends, family. And so we gather in a lot of different ways. And recently, during COVID and just with this virtual invitational space, we have been gathering for what we call virtual porches. It's an opportunity for us to have conversation and to gather, to bring support and ideas, to wrestle with questions that we might have, and just to do a lot of learning. And so we are so thankful that you have chosen to be here for today's virtual porch. I'm very excited to be able to pass the baton over to one of our new board members for Parents Reconciling Network. Lois Ann Murray is joining us, and she's going to do a full introduction of herself and share with you a little bit more about her background and her experience. But today you have come to join us for a conversation in which we have entitled Both And. It's an opportunity for us to acknowledge and talk about the real grief that can be present as you might be processing, again, whether or not you're a parent or a grandparent, aunt, uncle, or have personal connection and experience with coming out and having someone that identifies as LGBTQ plus in your life. And also the affirmation and the new dreams and possibilities that are also present in the midst of the journey, because that's indeed what we are all on, is a journey. And we hope that by being connected to this group, being a part of these conversations, that you feel strengthened, encouraged, emboldened to just feel empowered about how big and gracious and beautiful and diverse God's love is for each one of us. And so that is what we gather around today. And again, Lois Ann is going to share with us a little bit more. But let me just tell you a little bit about how we function in these virtual spaces. I do ask that you keep yourself on mute for the part where the presentation is happening, just so we can have our full attention on our speaker and facilitator today. But there will be a point where if you'd like to unmute yourself and either give a comment or ask a question or just participate in the conversation, you'll be invited to do so. But don't let that prevent you from, if you have thoughts or questions along the way as we are listening and learning. The chat is open and available and a great way to connect with each other. So if you just have, a thumbs up that you want to give, or, hey, this is what I experienced related to that, don't hesitate to utilize the chat, because we can learn from each other in a variety of different ways in this virtual space over this next hour that we have together. So again, welcome. Thank you for being here. We are just delighted to welcome Lois Ann, and I'm going to put the spotlight on her so that you can kind of see where she is. And we are just grateful for the opportunity to gather. So Lois Ann, introduce yourself and get us started today with our conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. I'm really excited to have an opportunity to lead us through this discussion on grief and grief healing. I've been drawn to this topic specifically as it relates to our queer children, because I've become more and more aware over the past several years of the difficulty that some parents have in joining their child on their gender identity journey. And I'm just really heartbroken when I hear stories of parents that tell their children they can no longer, that they're no longer welcome in their home, or refuse to acknowledge their child's plan to use, to present and be a different gender expression, or asked to have a different name used. And so I've given great thought to how that overlaps with the work that I do in grief. So to tell you a little bit about myself, I am a retired healthcare pharmacy professional. I worked for 43 years in pharmacy services, but I retired because I really wanted to reprioritize how I spent my time. I was ready to shift my focus to areas of service. I talk a lot about grief, probably a lot more than many people, because I lead the grief ministry for my local Methodist church. And I started doing that 8 years ago, really in response to my gratitude of the support and hand holding and care that I received when my husband had pancreatic cancer. To improve my ministry, I trained to become a grief education specialist. And I am certified to provide one-to-one and group education workshops to assist people in their healing. In those workshops, I use a program called the Grief Recovery Method Program. It's an evidence-based program, and it is taught around the world. I'm not going to be talking just about that program because this is not a grief recovery workshop, but I wanted to level set what my knowledge is and my experience. I also want to tell you what I'm not. I'm not a physician. I'm not a counselor or a social worker. I'm not qualified to do, nor do I provide clinical services or therapy to patients. So I hope those of you who are on this call, will add at the end of the discussion any comments you have with what I have shared, because your expertise is really valuable in this journey. I also wanted to let you know why I started participating in PRN. It was because I knew really intimately only one parent journey, and that was my own. And yet I knew I was also very interested in talking with more families. So I wanted to improve my knowledge of gender identity and terms, and I have really found that on the board. I am a mother of a 36-year-old cisgender gay man. He came out 10 years ago, which was several years after college. My son and his husband just celebrated their first anniversary on the 21st of December. They met, married, and live in South Africa. And I wanted to share that both my son and my son-in-law provide healing and health services, and specifically grief education as well. They are both in a really happy chapter of their lives, but their earlier chapters, they face many of the challenges and struggles that our children go through. So despite where they are today, I know from which the struggles they came. Switching the slide here. Okay, so my thoughts for our discussion today is to just think about, how does grief apply to the LGBTQ parent journey? Talk a little bit about the myths that are associated with grief. Discuss some common ways that we respond to grief as parents. Discuss whether there's tools available for helping our healing. And then how can we help each other as we fully affirm our child? Now, I'd like to start off with sharing some of the books on my bookcase that have influenced how I think about grief and how I speak to people about it. The two books on the left are from the Grief Recovery Method Institute, and that's the organization that certified me. It is an evidence-based program by Kent State University. It's existed for over 40 years. It's taught in 6 continents and has been translated to about 20 different languages. Thousands of people teach this program just as I do. And so it's one that I'm very familiar with and will refer to. But it's not the only thing that influences my thinking. A book I have really loved in this past couple years is Life is in the Transitions. And it talks to us about that our life is always going to be full of disruptors. Some of them will be small and hardly break our normal activity, and others will be huge earthquakes who have rippling aftershocks for 4 or 5 years. Bruce Feller identified about 7 tools of how we can address those transitions. And he talked a lot about the emotions that people feel of fear, sadness, and shame, as well as guilt, anger, and loneliness. As I read it, I felt like I was substituting the word grief every time he used the word transition, and many others have interpreted that as well. And the last book came on the market in December, The Myth of Closure. And it talks about ambiguous loss and also what we all share as we go through the pandemic. So they're good books. I wanted to identify them to you. And while I'm talking, think about what books are on your bookshelf that you might want to share as well. Sorry about that little hesitation in getting the slides. So when I was thinking about, well, does grief even really fit in a discussion with the PRN parents, I went to the PRN website and I did find that, yes, absolutely. PRN has previously identified the steps to accepting our children includes the emotion and activity of grief. In fact, listed it second on here before we can get to acceptance. And that was level setting for me because I know our goal is that we affirm our children and do everything we can to help them develop and maintain strong and supportive relationships with us. But sometimes we need to do our own work, and that's what grief work is. I'm going to put on the table a discussion of grief that many of you have probably heard over time. It's called the 6 stages of grief. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I share it with you as a reminder. I know many of you are familiar with it, that the things that we talk about here today have been talked by many specialists in the area. This is actually based on Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of death and dying, not grief, even though it's been transitioned and called stages of grief. It originally was designed by Kubler-Ross to address specifically stages of death and dying. Recently, David Kessler added to that and added a 6th stage, which is meaning. One thing I want to pause and mention when we look at the steps that PRN has or that are listed here is we always need to be careful when we talk about grief of thinking of it as a linear progression. Not everybody hits every stage, and often we will go back and revisit or do them in different orders, and that's just normal. And I wanted to be sure to take a moment to remind us that everybody's journey in grief is different. Sometimes I think instead of stages of grief, we should talk about symptoms of grief. So I want to dive into how do we define grief? And particularly because I think it doesn't sound like a harsh word to me, but as I shared with my son, and I shared with a good friend of mine, that they felt that the word was harsh. It felt very prickly to them to think of parents feeling grief over their coming out. And I just want to put that on the table for us to think about. While grief is a normal and natural reaction to a change or loss, I think culturally we really think of it as a loss, a death of someone. And I think also the word loss felt prickly to my son and my friend because it seemed like, well, if you're losing, you have less than something you had before. And certainly that's not what we're implying by using the word grief. So if we look at the second definition, maybe that's one we are more comfortable with, is grief is the response to the end or change of any familiar pattern. And so I offer both of those to you. One thing to keep in mind is that grief is often painful and can involve heartache, and healing it is really hard work and often directly related to the relationship that is causing you grief. They're intertwined. Let me just go back here for a minute. When I mentioned about the transitions, again, Bruce Feller talks about the end or change of something being a transition instead of a loss or grief. And so I welcome you if that works better for where you are in your emotional journey. I think either word is fine to use. One of the things I think is our first step when we talk about grief is trying to normalize it. Learning that grief and loss starts early in our life, and it's inevitable that we're going to have lots of loss. It doesn't start when your parents die. It doesn't start when your child comes out. We need to understand that loss and grief starts very early in our life. So one of the visuals that helps me when I think about grief is a backpack. And this is kind of like Jennifer Garner saying, what's in your wallet? Well, what's in your backpack when you think of grief? Because it's different for everyone. But we think about coming into this world with an empty backpack. We aren't born with grief, but we start to experience loss very early in life. Our children, we take away their binkies and their blankets. A child may have a pet die, or their parents come home and say, Dad's got a promotion, and now we're going, many states away, and they're leaving friends. They don't make a sports team, and they're disappointed about that. Unfortunately, sometimes the loss and grief is related around significant trauma. And bullying is an area that causes grief, and probably most of us on this call are familiar with that. And so my point is not to read all of those as much as to suggest and us hopefully agree that we go through life collecting grief experiences. And I think of them as filling your backpack with a rock. And so we pick up a little one here, and then down the road, we pick up a little bigger one because we really loved that dog. And then we have a really big one if a parent dies, or perhaps an addiction or other experience. So not all of our grief is equal, but it's also cumulative. And over time, our backpack of these losses can feel very heavy, and it influences and affects the resilience that you have to take on and address more loss. I did add at the bottom here that gender and sexual identity may may also be experienced and felt as a loss in terms of being different than expected. And so, not only obviously as parents do we feel grief in our journeys, but acknowledging and knowing that our children have as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we respond to grief, but I wanted, because I'm going to talk about myths, but I wanted to go back and look at the myths that PRN has identified that stigmatize our children. And I found this in the educational pamphlet. And I just give it as an example that when we have misinformation or calling that myths, how it so strongly influences our belief structure. And the same thing happens when we look at grief. There are myths associated with grief that influence our belief systems. And I'm going to go through a few of the things that I think we are taught wrong from the very beginning. And this would be a good point because I'm going to ask you later, what myths did you learn? What were you told about grief that influence how you respond today? Because we all have something that's been passed down to us, probably from our parents. And when we teach our children how to handle loss or grief, we generally teach what we learned from our parents. There isn't a course in school that says, you're going to have a lot of grief in your life and we're going to teach you how to handle that now. It's not a high school course. So we teach what we learned. And so it becomes a belief system in a family. One of the things that we do routinely is we tell children, don't feel bad. When they have a loss, they come home and they said, I had a really bad day. I didn't have my spelling test. I was bullied on the playground. And we have a tendency to dismiss that if we have not been trained differently to do that. We say, don't worry about it. I just made some homemade cookies. Let's sit down and enjoy those. Or even McDonald's Happy Meals. We really teach our children often, unless we've been trained differently, we teach them to bury their feelings when they feel bad. The second myth is we tell children you can replace your loss. Again, minimizing their experience and feelings. One that often happens, and maybe this happened as you grew up. You had a dog, the dog got old, the dog died, and you felt sad. And as part of consoling you, your parents might have said, we'll get another dog. We'll go this weekend, we'll get another dog. Or if you were older and in high school and the first time a relationship didn't work out, you were probably told there's other fish in the sea. You can replace that loss. Don't worry about it. So again, a pattern of how we have dismissed the feeling a child or ourselves feeling sad. We never say don't be happy about something, but we often say don't be sad. We historically, most people have told their children, grieve alone. We need to suppress that feeling. We don't share it with others. Go to your room if you want to cry. That, again, is invalidating the emotions of grief. Some children are taught you need to be strong, particularly if a parent died. If their mother died, well, looks like you're the woman of the house now. Or if their father died, you're going to have to be the man of this house, or a divorce. And that's a tremendous burden that we teach early, to be strong as you go through grief. We tell children to keep busy, just steamroll over those emotions. You'll be out of this class soon and in the 5th grade. So, keep busy, keep your head down, don't worry about it. And we tell children early that time heals all wounds. We don't really tell them the truth that grief requires actions. One of the things that happens that, in addition to sadness, is sometimes grief shows up with a wide range of other emotions. And we might not really recognize at first that what we're feeling is grief because it can show up in many different ways: anger, confusion, guilt, remorse, heartache. All of these are very, very valid emotions that occur when we experience a loss or a change in routine. And so it's important for us to see that in ourselves, that maybe a way we are responding to something is really a result of grief that we're feeling. I want to take a moment again to remind us that feeling grief is not a rejection of your child. It's really the conflicting both emotions that we can feel. So we've just talked about a lot of emotions that are painful and hard. And generally, what do we do with those feelings that are painful? And one of the things I just wanted to put on the table for us to understand and ask you even to reflect on your own life, although this is not going to be something I ask you at the end to disclose in this form, but we often turn to grief relieving behaviors. We overeat, we overshop. And although exercise is a really good thing to do, there are times that people just dive in and over exercise. Video games, gambling, running away. The list is long of activities that give short-term relief to our pain, but clearly in excess can be dangerous to us, causing addictions or causing financial implications. So it's important knowing that this is how we sometimes or often respond to grief, that we think about, are there other behaviors that we can do alternatively? So one of the things that I think is very important, and part of this is because I run workshops and invite people to come in and help them, is that we should consider seeking help on our journeys with grief. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. It doesn't need to be, a one-to-one or group workshop. Doesn't need to be grief recovery. There are other alternatives for us to seek as parents. Professional counselors are very important. Often we have clergy that are prepared to help. I know, Jim, you've run workshops and support groups and discussions to help parents identify with each other and talk about their journey when their children come out. But the bottom thing is we should seek support, and doing that is a strength. It's not a weakness. We have to put that myth behind us of be strong, just go through this. Going on a journey blind is not the right way of going about this. Seek support, whether it's a program like I work with, or something offered in your church or your community, or professional counseling. Going alone is a very hard way of addressing grief. So we talk about action steps, not destructive behaviors. What are some steps that maybe we could take to look at how we're feeling and the grief? And we've started to begin to do that just in our discussion today. But the first step, I think, is understanding that what we've been taught in the past likely isn't working, probably a myth. And so our current belief systems, if you haven't sought support outside of what you learned from your parents, will not bring healing. It takes other steps. An additional step that I think is very, and suggest to you is helpful for us as parents, is look at our own experience with grief and our grief relieving behaviors. Perhaps we not only see in our children behaviors that they're using to express their grief, but we also may be modeling behaviors in excess that relieve us for the moment, but does not directly help us with our healing. Number 3 is a step that personally helped me as I've addressed grief in my life. Going back to the backpack that I talked about is allowing yourself to reflect on what has been your journey with grief. What are those rocks that are in your backpack? When did you collect them? And look and reflect on your life as far back as you can remember, and start making a note of the losses that you have had. Because understanding what's in your backpack does a couple of things. It helps you to know what is really causing your pain. Often we think it might be that, I'm feeling really particularly sad because of issues around my child, but you might still be carrying old grief that is showing up in this change, but was never really relieved in the past. So I've been taught to do a loss history graph, and I keep updating it because my loss graph is not over. Since I did the first one, I've had additional losses in my life. Retirement was a loss. So understanding your transitions or losses is important. Identifying which ones are unresolved and causing you the most emotion is what I suggest in number 4. And then sometimes you can put in perspective, really, how big is that rock that represents your child coming out? It may feel much bigger to you than it actually is. You may say, oh, I've handled these type of things before, or I'm feeling really like this is a heavy rock because of lost relationships maybe that you had with your family or hurt from your church in the past. It helps you to sort through and weigh and put in order your losses. Number 6 is a tool that I've used, and I lay it out as an example, is really reflect on your relationship with your queer child. I went back and thought of my child's journey from before he was born, and all the hopes and dreams, and how excited, if it was a boy, that we would give him a family name, and reflected on what brought me joy when he was a child, what I was proud of. But I also acknowledged that there were times that we had what we called lines below, which is things that caused pain in our relationship. And but in the end, you can see your child with both the positive values and aspects and things they've learned from you and that you're proud of, and also acknowledge what has been painful in that journey. And The last step is, as you look at that, is there undelivered communication that might help you in your healing? Did you tell your child enough how proud you were of them as they were growing up and how proud you still are of them? Are there actions that you reflect on or behaviors that you might have had that you wish you hadn't? That there's an apology that you need to understand and acknowledge to your child? Um, did you ask your child to leave home and now regret that? That's still that's an unresolved communication if your heart has changed, but you haven't shared that. Um, maybe maybe you asked your child to dress differently. We're going to church. Put something else on. Maybe you part of your grief was embarrassment or shame. Each person has to be able to identify for themselves what they felt, how it influenced their actions, and whether they need a healing step to be taken in communication surrounding that. I want to acknowledge that these steps are hard. They really require you to dig deep into your heart, to be honest with yourself, and to create new communication with your child. And so this isn't something you do easily. You set time aside, and maybe several times, short times to set aside, and think about that experience with your child, what's important, what's uncommunicated, and how do you fix that. These are the categories of communication that I have used and share with others. Um, I've just touched on them, so apologies. What do you regret? What do you wish? You know, one of the things I regretted is I didn't realize my son was suffering or struggling. And I thought his struggles were something else than with his sexual identity. I wish I could have understood more and helped him more. And that's an apology that I feel strongly in my heart. Forgiveness, again, it's giving up any resentment or anger that happened along that journey with your child. A lot of times, forgiveness, you don't go back to your child and really say this directly to them. This work is heart work and something you're acknowledging to yourself so you can move forward. Um, but there are times where likely our children, because they have experienced grief and demonstrated it in many different ways, might have exhibited behavior that we need to also forgive them for in our hearts. So apologies and forgivenesses are very, very important. It's a good time to also just think, what do I really feel so strongly with about my child? You know, I love your eyes. My son has the bluest eyes, and I work hard to remember to tell him that that's something that is significant with him, or his values, or how kind. If he's your friend, you've got a friend forever. Being ability to acknowledge what are these strong emotions, and then fond memories as well. Because what we want to do is be able to reflect on a relationship that is changing and to be able to bring it to closure so that we can move forward with creating a new relationship with a strong foundation. So my hope is that these actions are steps you can reflect on in your relationship with your child, bring closure to grief that you had or past patterns. Um, How you use these tools are going to depend greatly on what your child's journey is. And this is particularly, I think, I don't have a transgender child. So this is not an area that I speak from experience. But I have felt that that is a particular situation where a child is verbalized, I'm not that gender, and I don't want to use that name. And that name is dead to me. And so being able to close that relationship, say, I love you, goodbye to your child prior to their where they are in their journey, I think can be very powerful. It's something that I hope you'll share with me if you agree or if you have formally taken a step like this or a ceremony. And all of this is really with the goal of completing a relationship, removing the pain, finishing communications so that you can move forward with a healed heart and a new approach. So that was a foundation that I wanted to lay for our discussion and allow us to open up and react to some of the information that I laid out for our discussion today. And so, Emily, these are some of the questions. They don't need to be in any particular order, but I am curious to know which definition of grief resonates with the people who are here today. Is the first one too prickly and hurtful? Do you prefer transitions? Do you prefer to say a change in a frequent pattern? So there may also be some things in the chat. I'm going to stop now so that we can hear from others, many of which may be even more expert in grief than I am.
Lois Ann, thank you so much already for the gift that you have given us today in this conversation. If we could, those that are on video, just give Lois Ann a virtual affirmation of just
Thank
gratefulness for sharing your experience and your expertise as it comes to grief and grief processing. I do think this is the point where we would invite you all to join in and to be support for one another. So again, you're welcome to use the chat if you just want to type something in, or if you want to let me know either by raising your hand or just unmuting yourself if you have a comment. But I would love to take that first one for a question that Lois Ann has put in front of us. What definition of grief resonates with you? Is there anyone who would like to respond to that in any way with us today?
Sure, Emily. Yeah, Eric Swanson. I just wanted to thank you so much for this presentation. This is outstanding. And so glad that it's been recorded, and we're going to be sharing with lots of folks on this. And so to the question, for me, it's just the, I think grief is it's a good word. And for me, it's loss of something or some feeling, or I think that's what it represents for me, and how one reacts to that loss. So that would be it for me.
Thanks,
Thank
Eric.
you.
I saw Karen, I believe, also raised your hand.
Yeah, I was going to say, I really appreciated the sharing of the end or change, or the change in familiar pattern, because I was kind of struggling with some of that idea of the word loss, right? I hadn't actually lost my child. And, while maybe there was some loss of certain hopes or dreams, there's also plenty of new hopes and dreams. But when I could think of it in terms of the idea of just end or change, And I don't give myself a lot of room to grieve, just period in general. So on all sorts of topics, that idea of just thinking about changes in familiar pattern, I thought that was really helpful. And I'm actually looking forward to doing some more processing because of that.
Wonderful. I think that that's a really helpful comment. And there are likely many others who kind of wrestle with that. I noted that, like, I appreciated the acknowledgement of the word prickly, because it kind of does have that feeling, and people have different reactions to how they've experienced grief. And Lois Ann, you helped to frame like maybe some of the myths and the ways that we might have learned or unlearned what grief can be in our childhood and growing up on into adulthood. So maybe that's a good kind of segue into that question to Lois Ann that you pose about, are there additional myths that you have been taught growing up that you're like, I would add this one to the list because I experienced it, that might also be helpful to others as we think about, yeah, what am I holding about grief and whether or not it's good or bad or how to do it or how not to do it, that we might need to spend a little bit of time self-evaluating and helping each other to kind of realize. Does anybody have something to add to the list that Lois Ann has presented us with today?
Well, I think you
see the whole screen. So
did someone else start talking? I don't want to talk over them.
I was just scrolling to make sure I wasn't missing anybody. I don't believe so. So go ahead, Lois Ann. What were you going to say?
Well, come on. I think we're missing one of the most obvious. God doesn't give us more than you can handle, won't give you more than you can handle. That is often said, particularly of those of us with faith. And there are a number of layers in that we don't need to get into today with that statement. But I think I heard that so many times when my husband died. You're strong, be strong. God won't give you more than you can handle. Luckily, my pastor corrected that for me. But other family myths? Well, good. Had people heard?
One.
Actually,
Liz, let's go with Liz Roberts and then Eric, if y'all can share.
Sure. And I'm not sure how much of this is family or just societal, but I feel like there's the myth that it's selfish to grieve. It's not yours to grieve, especially as a parent of a child who's figuring out who they are on their journey and they're suffering so much, or you think they are, or they may, all of those things. Same thing with loss of anything. Like I work with college students and I watch them go through grief process, even in great moments, right? When they're graduating and moving on to life, they're grieving, leaving the life that they've had. But then I have to grieve because I'm losing these students. Like, it's that kind of thing. And it's that sense of it's not mine to grieve. And yet it very much is. And so I think that myth is very difficult for some of us to let go of.
Thank you. That's helpful. Eric, did you have another one?
yeah, it was just along the line what Lois Ann said, and it was, well, with every closed door comes an open window.
Yeah.
And, yeah, similar line.
There's lots of colloquialisms that I think we develop in different kind of cultures and family dynamics that we, oh, that phrase, yes, I can hear my grandmother, I can hear my parents saying that to us. So there might be more that come to you as you kind of reflect a little bit more fully on what have been some of those encounters that you've had with what grief looks like as we go.
I just want to add another one. Just again, especially people of faith. Sometimes I've heard people put on people, well, you just need to have more faith.
Oh, yeah.
To me, that's a heavy one in terms of the guilt that puts on someone, the load that puts on someone. If whatever the situation may be, you need more faith. And so I would just add that one in too. That's a damaging one, really.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. The implying that there's some kind of deficit that must be there it can be dangerous for sure.
I think that people are well-meaning when they say these to you. And some things they say, like, we've heard of people when they've lost a child that didn't come to term early. Well, you're young, you still have time to have more children. Some of this is true and intellectually true, but it's not helpful and it's not good heart work and it's not addressing the pain and the heart elements that you're feeling. So people mean well, people don't know what to say, and they're fast to dismiss your sadness and grief. And we need to be careful of perpetuating that.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you naming that, Lois Ann. And I think that we often hear that, like, people are well meaning. And even there, I believe, is an opportunity for us to kind of enact some of that action orientedness that you were talking about, even in this grieving, is that in order for that not to be perpetuated in even society or with folks, is to, have an opportunity to say, I appreciate that you mean that well, but that actually is not helpful to me right now. I'm grieving, like, just naming that grief,
Mhm.
and it's okay, like, that I need to be where I am. And I know we can't do that in every space, that sometimes you're passing somebody in church and they say something and you're like, ooh, that didn't help me.
I know.
But I do want to encourage all of us that when there are opportunities that are safe and comfortable for us, to speak into these misperceptions and these myths that do exist, and help each other to learn and to grow and to know that that's really not a helpful comment. And once again, I acknowledge that can't happen all the time and everywhere, but I think that's the only way that we myths disappear or don't have that kind of power over us, is to say, I I reject that. I reject
Mhm.
that comment or that attitude or that sentiment, because it is. I don't believe it to be true. I don't believe it to represent where I am or who I am or what I need right now. And to kind of turn that on people, I think is important. So I just want to name that, and I think that's true in a lot of different things. Is this the idea of well-meaning people, and we just got to let them, well, they meant well, so we just got to let them be, is not, this does not help our work towards justice often. And again, that can be true in a lot of different scenarios, not just related to grief or LGBTQ folks, but when it comes to racial justice and a whole number of different ways that we are justice seekers in God's world. So I'll just kind of add that thought in there as we're processing about some of these things that we might hold in our minds, and that we can help support and support each other on our journeys and in some concrete ways. So, well, we are getting close to the end of our time, and I certainly think that these last two questions are important. And so here's an invitation that we have in front of us. Is Lois Ann has asked us, what tools or action steps have you used that you found to be helpful and that you'd recommend to others? And then also, what's on your bookshelf? Lois Ann shared with us 4 books early on. I already noted in the chat that we will make this presentation as well as the recording of this available, so that you might share it with someone. It'll be on YouTube, so it'll be public access for people to reflect on further. But we would love to hear from you. Again, this is an opportunity for us to learn and grow together. And we know that you all have experiences and touch points that might help other people who are at a similar place along their journey. So I would just always invite you that you can respond to our emails or get in touch with us uh, in a variety of different ways. You can always just send me an email. It's just emily@rmnetwork.org. But if you have some thoughts on these, particularly these last 2, that when I send out the recording and send out this presentation, I would love to include some of these ideas that have bubbled up today, so that you can continue to reflect with one another even beyond this hour that we've been gathered here in this space. Lois Ann, is there anything else you want to share as we close out today's time?
No, I welcome people to reach out to me if you think I really missed something or you reject an idea that I have, or particular number three, the tools too. And my email is pretty easy to remember. It's Lois Ann at loisannmurray.com. I'd love to hear from you because in order to just show my screen, I wasn't able to see the chat or facial expressions when we talk. So I'm not really clear on how this has been received. But I hope it was helpful and stimulates more discussion with your family as well, not just among us, but with others.
It truly has been a gift for me today, Lois Ann, and I know it has been for others. We can see those comments in the chat and just from being gathered today. So let me just send you forth with a blessing as you go about your day, and just take and receive this, if you will. Go knowing that God is ever present with you, within you, around you, and may God's presence of abundant love and belovedness that God claims on you and your life go with you, supporting you, uplifting you, encouraging along your way. We are all on a journey. Go faithfully and be God's. Amen. So thank you for being here today, everyone, and we will see you again soon for the next PRN virtual porch. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.